And as we unpack it and look at it, we will discover some advice on aging. This Old House. Now, I know This Old House is a PBS program in which they restore houses. And I've gotten into watching that. I like to restore old houses. I wouldn't want to do the work for anybody. Some of the stuff they have to do is just amazing, how they manage to restore these old homes. But I've entitled this morning's message, This Old House, because I'm talking about this old house. And the Word of God and how we approach aging. And the things we need to rejoice in, remove, and remember. There's the outline. Many of you may have watched 60 Minutes for years, when at the end of the show, a gentleman by the name of Andy Rooney would give his 2 minutes worth of wisdom and insight into life. Here's a quote I found by Andy Rooney on aging. He said, "It's paradoxical that the idea of living a long life appeals to everyone, but the idea of getting old doesn't appeal to anyone." We want to live a long life and enjoy it, but we don't want to get old. It seems to me that that's just part of what you sign up for. And then the opposite end of the spectrum, a me generation, a current cultural revelation of insight into aging from a pop musical star, Jessica Simpson, makes this great observation. I had to get up off the floor after I finished reading it. 23 is old. It's almost 25, which is almost like mid-20s. Think about it. Two perspectives on aging. 23 is almost 25, and it's almost like mid-20s. Jessica, it is mid-20s, and it's not old. This Old House. Let's read the text this morning. We're going to start in chapter 11 and verse 7, and we're going to run right down through chapter 12 and verse 7. "The light is pleasant, and it's good for the eyes to see the sun. Indeed, if a man should live many years, let him rejoice in them all, and let him remember the days of darkness, for they will be many. Everything that is to come, futility. Rejoice, young man, during your childhood, and let your heart be pleasant during the days of young manhood, and follow the impulses of your heart and the desires of your eyes. Yet know that God will bring you to judgment for all these things. So remove grief and anger from your heart, and put away pain from your body, because childhood and the prime of life are fleeting. Remember also your Creator, the days of your youth, before the evil days come, and the years draw near when you will say, I have no delight in them. Before the sun and the light, and the moon and the stars are darkened, and the clouds return after the rain. In the day that the watchmen of the house tremble, and the mighty men stoop, and grinding ones stand idle because they are few. And those who look through windows grow dim. And the doors on the street are shut as the sound of the grinding mill is low. And one will rise at the sound of a bird, and all the daughters of song will sing softly. Furthermore, men are afraid of a high place and of terrors on the road. The almond tree blossoms, the grasshopper drags himself along, and the caperberry is ineffective. For man goes to his eternal home, while mourners go about in the street. Before the silver cord is broken and the golden bowl is crushed, the pitcher by the well is shattered, and the wheel at the cistern is crushed. Then the dust will return to the earth as it was, and the spirit will return to God who gave it. Let's pray. Lord, this morning you give us a lot of words on how to age. You give us wisdom on how to live our life. You take a long look back at our youth and encourage us to build on a solid foundation. You remind us that the reality of life is there are many things that we should rejoice in, yet the reality of life is, as we age, we approach the sober reality that it is not eternal, not this one. You remind us in this passage, Lord, that there's someone that we're going to have to explain the way we lived our life to. You remind us as we age the things we can do to help age gracefully. honorable, and holy. And so I pray, Lord, this morning, by your Spirit's power, through the word you've given us, you will change the way we think, the way we view, the way we live out our lives, even as we grow older. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Well, Andy and Jessica have given us something to think about in aging. One of the idols of our current age and culture is the idol of youth. Plastic surgeons do thousands of surgeries every year to lift, tuck, and hide and inject so we can avoid the reality of age. In the long run, we bow quite frequently in our culture to the age of youth. Here in this text, instead of bowing to the idol of youth, Solomon tells us how to grow old gracefully and godly. And not only does he tell us how to grow gracefully and godly, he also tells us how to live our life even from the very beginning of our days. And so this morning we're going to look at three things. The first is rejoice, old and young. You've got something you can rejoice about, both in your age and in your youth. So in verses 7 and 8, he talks, first of all, to those who are aging, and he looks back and gives some advice, probably from his own categories of aging. Why rejoice? Why rejoice as we age? Verse 7 says, "The light is pleasant and good for the eyes to see the sun." First of all, it's good for us to rejoice because of the goodness of life. Because of the goodness of life. As we age, he encourages us to remember when. There are a lot of things that as a younger person I didn't really think about nor enjoy. The smell of new mown hay has a particular recall in my memory now. I drive my summer school route for school to pick up kids out in the country area, and 2 weeks ago they mowed some hay. And early in the morning, as we went out to pick up a child out in the country, I caught a whiff of new mown hay. And it took me back a long time ago when I was sweating my brains out picking up hay in the field. And the smell of new mown hay then meant work, hard work. But the smell of new mown hay 50 years later is a smell that brings back a lot of memories that are good. It brings back the memory of feeding the hay and enjoying sweet cream and non-pasteurized milk. Whole milk that had only been chilled down to 38 degrees. It brought back the memory of a hamburger and a steak that feed had supplied. Every time I smell Johnson baby powder, I think of the birth of my 3 daughters. And it causes me to rejoice in the goodness of life, even though now I'm older. Sunrises were sunrises then. They're beautiful works of art now. And I look across the landscape of my life like you might do, and say, here's the point that God was good to me. Here's the point that God was good to me. Here's the point that God was good to me. Here's the point that God took care of me. Here's the point that God delivered me, protected me, provided for me in ways I wouldn't understand. And one of the pieces of advice that Solomon gives us in verse 7 to answer the question, why rejoice? Because there were some good things in life worth rejoicing over. As a follower of Jesus Christ, I take very seriously the passage in the Psalms that says, let the redeemed of the Lord say so. In a little bit, we'll see how that relates to another area of our life. Why rejoice? First of all, because of the goodness of life. He goes on in verse 8, indeed, if a man should live many years, let him rejoice in them all. Some people don't get long lives for many different reasons. I was blessed in my ancestry and DNA and genetics to have 3 out of 4 grandparents live into their hundreds. My mother and father lived to 97 and 98. I remember sitting as a little kid on a couch in my grandfather's house listening to him tell stories about how they farmed. And he lived long enough to see the difference between horses hitched to a single-bladed plow and mowing with a horse-drawn sickle and thatching hay in the field and then bringing it in, and tractors and balers and planters that would plant more than 2 rows at a time. He lived to see hearing aids and telephones. He was one of the first recipients of a thing called Social Security. My dad lived long enough to travel halfway around the world in a world war and see sights before macular degeneration took his eyesight. One of the reasons to rejoice is because of the goodness of life. Deuteronomy 6:2, God tells the children of Israel that if they will obey His commands, He will give them long life, which is a blessing. Psalm 91:16, which is on the front cover of your folder this morning, says, with long life will I satisfy him and show him my salvation. Long life is a blessing from God. Why rejoice? Because of the goodness of life. But ever the realist, Solomon reminds us, all through Ecclesiastes, that we take the rejoicing along with the reality. In verse 8 he goes on, he says, let us rejoice if we live many years. Let us rejoice in them all. And then he says, and let him remember the days of darkness, for they will be many. It almost sounds like he's giving us contradictory advice. Wait a second, he just said rejoice in the long years of living. That's right. But he's also a realist. He says, get ready for age. Age. Because there will be many days of darkness. It doesn't mean blackout. He means aging. Things will change as you grow older. Just be aware of it. Get ready for it. I love the people who say aging is a state of mind. I think young all the time. I think paisley prints and wide whale corduroy jeans. And I think the Beatles' hair all the time. I think of eating goldfish and putting how many people in a phone booth. You can't find a phone booth or hardly a paid phone booth. Get ready, Solomon says. Why rejoice? Because get ready for what's ahead of you. He's a realist. Why rejoice? First of all, because of the goodness of life, the longevity of life, and secondly, what's ahead, the reality of life. He tells us in verse 7 in the first part of 8 to be joyful about life and a long life because of its many happy pleasures. But he's also a realist. He says, be sober about its sorrows. We're trying to think up ways all the time to beat aging. From cryogenics to gene manipulation, and on and on and on it goes. The reality is, we all age. And then he's got a word in rejoice old and young, and he turns from those of us who are aging to the youngest. Verse 9, for you youngest, rejoice, he says in verse 9. Young man, during your childhood, let your heart be pleasant during the days of young manhood. And follow the impulses of your heart and the desires of your eyes. It almost sounds like, at that point in verse 9, he says, if you're young, just go out and do whatever you want to do. Now, of course, he's not saying that because earlier in the book of Ecclesiastes, he's looked at his own life in his youth, and the pursuit of pleasure didn't give a satisfactory meaning to life. So no, he's not saying to all of us who are young, you can go do whatever you want to do. No, but he is saying rejoice in the strength of youth. I can't do what I did 10 years ago. I sure can't do what I did 20 years ago. It's hard for me to remember what I did 30 years ago. But I know I can't do it then. We mowed the yard and took care of the yard yesterday, Gail and I did, and we spent 3 hours outside and 6 hours recuperating. Thank God for jacuzzi. And I do the realities of life. But he says to the youngins, you have an opportunity to do something in your youth. So rejoice in it and follow and do what your heart sets to do. Let your heart be pleasant during the days of young manhood. Follow the impulses of your heart and desires of your eyes. You have the strength to do it. You have the ability to recuperate faster, so get out there and get busy. But remember this, he says in verse 9. Rejoice in your youth. I could stay up all night with my friends out watching a movie or playing softball or doing all kinds of things that I wouldn't admit ever to doing. And get up the next morning and go out and milk the cows and bounce back quickly. I can't stay up past 10:30. Doesn't happen anymore. The body doesn't bounce back. But here's what he says in verse 9. As he tells the young people, you're young and strong and go out and pursue life, he says, yet remember this. Yet remember this. Yet know that God will bring you to judgment for all these things. And I look back across my life now, and I keep hearing in the back of my head the sound of my father and my mother saying, remember, you'll have to give an account of what you do in your youth. There are consequences. Always remember, Solomon tells us, Solomon the aged tells us, even looking back across his own life, remember you're accountable to God for all these things in life. Remember, God will bring you to judgment. God will hold you accountable. accountable. Rejoice for the strength of your youth, he says in verse 9. But remember, you have to answer to God for what you've done. And that includes everything you have done. Rejoice, old and young. Why rejoice? Because life is filled with the goodness of God. And you can go back and point to those points in your life. The reality of getting older. Solomon says, rejoice, but yet in a real world, remember, we're getting older and things will change in your life. To the young ones, he says, you've got strength, you've got dreams. Get out there and do them. But remember this, what you do, you are accountable for. It's not a blank check to do whatever you please without consequence or accountability. Then remove. Verse 10. Very interesting verse. Because it's kind of a puzzle as to what he means. He says, so remove grief and anger from your heart and put away pain from your body. What in the world is he talking about? Remove grief and anger from your heart and put away pain from your body. There isn't anybody sitting here this morning, or anybody that we know outside these walls, who wouldn't like to get away from the realities of life that cause us grief and anger, and to put away pain from our body. We'd all like to be whole and pain-free. So what in the world is he talking about when he says remove it? I look in our cupboard where we keep our medicines, and it's getting fuller and fuller and fuller. And I'm thinking to myself, a sure sign of age. Used to have a bottle of Tylenol, and a bottle of ibuprofen, and a bottle of vitamins, and now we got all kinds of stuff. Exacerbate the problem. I can't remember when to take them, so I got pill bottles on the table. And to exacerbate the problem even more, I looked and I missed one day sometime. I thought, man, I know I took that pill. Oh, there it is. Wednesday's still there. And this is Thursday. What in the world is he talking about here in verse 10? And he says, remove. Remove that. The old translation says the things that vex us. Well, nobody uses the word vex anymore, and we don't know what the word vex means. Vex. What is vexation? Vexation is any problem that causes us to worry or give us concern. It literally meant that which angers, grieves, or irritates. Well, my stars, that's all of life. What do you mean remove it? Put away pain from your body. Or as the old translation puts it, evil from your body. What in the world is he talking about? What he's talking about is how we deal with the aches and the pains and the realities of life from a physical and mental standpoint. See, verse 10 is a mental health verse here in Ecclesiastes 10. And I've said it before and I'll say it again. Ecclesiastes doesn't give you all the answers in the text. It forces you to go outside the book of Ecclesiastes to answer the problems. So what's the preacher's point in verse 10? Here's his point. Here's what he means when he talks about remove grief and anger from your heart and put away pain from your body. Here's what he's talking about. Here's his point. He says, remove discouragement from your souls. How in the world do you do that? Because he doesn't tell you in verse 10. Remove discouragement from your souls and minimize damage to your body. His point is this: take care of your physical and your mental health. But he never says in that text how to do that. So let me give you a way to take care of that. It's found over in the book of Philippians, chapter 4, verses 6 and 7. Here's what Paul says to the Philippian believers. And the key word in the book of Philippians is the word rejoice. How in the world does a believer rejoice in this world and while they're raging at the same time? With all of the adversity and difficulties and sicknesses and everything that comes to us in this life, how in the world do we rejoice? Paul says in verse 4 of Philippians 4, rejoice in the Lord always. Again, I will say rejoice. Then in verse 6 he says this, be anxious for nothing. There's that synonym for vex. Remove the vexation from your heart. Anxiousness, worry. Be anxious for nothing, Paul says. That's an imperative. It's not a suggestion. It's a command. And I hope you do better at it than I do. Be anxious for nothing. So how do I not be anxious? How do I remove the vexation of my heart? There's that key word in the Bible, the word but, to show you a contrast. Instead of worry, do this. But in everything, by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving. Those are three kinds of prayers. Prayer is the basic word to prostrate yourself before someone who has a greater authority and power than you. Supplication is a term for beg, plead. Thanksgiving means to be grateful. So how do I get over worry? First of all, I acknowledge in my prayers that God is greater than my problems. In my supplication, I plead for His remedy. In my thanksgiving, I acknowledge that only He can help me get rid of the discouragement of my soul. If you ever take time to read some of those Psalms that David unloads his heart to God, you discover he unloads, first of all, the problem. And then he starts rehearsing who God is. And by the end of the Psalm, he's thanking God. How do you remove the vexation of life? You go to God. Be anxious for nothing. In everything, by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God. What happens when you do that? I can't explain it so that you will accept my explanation. All I know is that God honors His Word. Verse 7 says, and the peace of God, which surpasses all comprehension, that gives me the out. I know it works. I can't tell you how it works. I just know God says it will work. It's beyond my rational comprehension to understand how that when I take the concerns of life and remove it from my heart, God gives me peace. And a lot of times God gives me that peace not only because I pray, but because I have hid His Word in my heart that I might not sin against Him. He reminds me of what He said. And the peace of God, which surpasses all comprehension. The picture there in verse 7 we don't often get, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. You want something that will form a barrier around your mind and thought process? Involve yourself in the Word of God and prayer to God, and He will set a guard around you. Around your mind. Now you've got to do your part. Verse 8. Finally, brethren, whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is of good report, if there is any excellence and if anything worthy of praise, dwell on these things. Put your mind on this. Stop thinking about all the junk in the world. Start thinking about what God has given and done for you. And that's in the middle voice in the original language. It means you control what you think about. That's what Solomon means in Ecclesiastes 11:10. Put away what vexes you. If it irritates you, get your mind off of it and put it on something else. Remove the evil from your flesh. As much as you've got the capability to take care of the aches and pains of your life, you ought to do that. And if you're burning the candle at both ends, let me tell you something, that's not a godly command. Solomon says that's foolishness. Remove grief and anger from your heart. That's mental health. Put away pain from your body. Take care of your physical body as much as is humanly possible. Ultimately, the mental health checkup of Philippians 4, 6, and 7 is to cast our cares on God and leave them there. Then finally he says, remember. Many of you may have committed to memory Ecclesiastes 12:1. Remember equals live a God-centered life. In Solomon's view of aging, he goes back to his early days and he recounts how David had taught him. Remember, it's Solomon who writes Proverbs 1 through 6. It's Solomon who in Proverbs 2, 3, and 4 says, when I was a boy, when I was a son, I remembered my father's instruction. Keep the Lord's commandments and seek wisdom. Did he always do that in his life? No. And now, as he ends Ecclesiastes, he's looking back across his life and he says, I should have done better. And here's where I went wrong. When I was young, I did not live a God-centered life. That's what the word remember means here. He's calling the young and the old alike to continue to build their lives on God and live a God-centered life all of their life. And so he says in verse 1, remember also your Creator in the days of your youth. Because the evil days will come, and the years will draw near when you will say, I have no delight in them. You will get old, and you will look back across your life, and you will say, I wish I'd done that differently. And he's telling us, don't do that. Live your whole life as a God-centered life, because everything in your life matters to God. I don't know how many people I've shared the gospel with and got the same excuse. I'll do it when I'm older. Right now I want to do what I want to do. Even I thought it. And then I read Ecclesiastes 11:9 and it says, yet know that you will face God and give account, even for your deeds. So don't put it in. Remember, live a God-centered life. What's a God-centered life? It's making God our first and highest priority, from youth to old age. Making God our first and highest priority. Then in verses 2 through 7, he gets into this old house. Verse 2, he talks about the reality of aging. He says it seems like there's one storm after another storm after another storm. In verse 2 he says, before the sun and the light, the moon and the stars are darkened, the clouds return after the rain. When you were younger, it seemed like there was time between life's storms. Now that you're aging, guess what? It seems like it's one thing right after another, after another, after another, after another. That's what verse 2 means. It seems like it's always stormy and cloudy and rainy. Then in verse 3, he begins to describe, in this old house, he begins to describe what we all know in our lives. Verse 3, in the day that the watchmen of the house trembled, the watchmen of your arms. can't keep my arms above my head as long as I used to. Right in here, it starts burning. I can't pick up what I used to pick up. I can't open jars as easily as I used to. The strong men of the house tremble. The watchmen of the house tremble. Your arms. And the mighty men stoop. That's your legs. You ever put a stopwatch on how long it takes you to get up? Do you remember back when it was like that? I look at little ones and wish I could be as flexible as they are. The mighty men stoop, that's your legs. The grinding ones stand idle. GT. Some of us, we can take them in and out. Some of us have a few originals and many replacements. The grinding ones stand idle because they are few. Not many dentists in Solomon's day. And those who look through windows grow dim. The eyesight goes. Squint. You got to turn the light on. Read. The windows are dim, your eyes. Verse 4, the doors on the street are shut as the sound of the grinding mill is low. The doors are the ears. They've lost their hearing. The grinding mill is low. That's kind of an interesting one. What in the world does he mean by that? He means that the normal daily routine of younger years has gone away. Grinding grain or bread was an everyday occurrence. And now the grinding mill is low. You are out of touch with your old daily routine. Life is moving on and you're not able to keep up with the daily routine of life you had. Grinding mill is low. Normal daily living is changing. One will arise at the sound of a bird. You don't sleep long. I wake up and I don't want to wake up. And I have a hard time going back to sleep. And I don't sleep that long. One arises at the sound of a bird, and all the daughters of song will sing softly. Your ears go. Your vocal cords are gone. The daughters of song, the voice you used to have, you don't have anymore. The vocal cords have aged. And then he goes on in the next verse. He says, furthermore, men are afraid of a high place and of terrors on the road. All of a sudden we become afraid of things. I'm not going to get up on that ladder anymore. Somebody younger can get up there. That's too high for me. Not going there. I'm not going there after night. You never know what's going to happen there. You don't even know what's going to happen in broad daylight. Fear, dread begins to become part of our life. And he says, there in verse 5, he says, the almond tree blossoms. Some of you have wonderful almond trees on top of your head. Some of us are challenged. Okay. Almond trees in the springtime were pale white. And he takes that picture of an almond tree in springtime and he looks at the process of aging and he says, our hair has gone from whatever color it was for a few years to white. Process of aging. And then he gives us a picture, and I just scratch my head at this every time, at the reality of it. He says, the grasshopper drags himself along. All the grasshopper's eye ever knew jumped and hopped and were nuisance. But the grasshopper is aged to the point it can't hop anymore. And it drags itself along. And then he points us to the reality of what happens next, in the next few phrases. Caperberry is ineffective. For man goes to his eternal home while mourners go about in the street. The reality of aging, folks, is that we come to the end of life. And then in verses 6 and 7, he talks about the reality of death. It says, remember him before the silver cord is broken and the golden bowl is crushed, the pitcher by the well is shattered, and the wheel at the cistern is crushed. All are pictures there in verse 6 of dying, death. Then the dust will return to the earth as it was, and the spirit will return to God who gave it. One of the things he talks about in this passage is the fact that we lose our capacity to remember things. I try and tell stories of things that happened when my daughters were young. I get it all mixed up, and my wife tells me after I told the story, you got it all wrong. You've forgotten how that went. And I've come to the conclusion it's easier to admit, yep, you're right, than it is to try and get it sorted out. One of the realities of aging is that we don't remember what we used to. Sometimes we don't even remember things that we think we ought to remember. And those who do studies in memory loss tell us as long as you can remember that you forgot something, you're still in safe water. I find little comfort in solving that. I find little comfort in that. But here's what I know. Here's what many of you know. That even when we can't remember the details of life gone by, we can remember one thing. We can remember God. And when that goes, and it might very well happen, there's one thing you need to remember. Even though you may forget God as you age in your mind, He never forgets you. In John chapter 6, Jesus said this. This is the will of Him who sent me, that of all that He has given me, I lose nothing. In the last months of both of my parents' life, their minds went away. It's hard not to be remembered by your mom and dad. And when you have to yell loud enough to wake the dead to get them to hear, it's even harder. And yet, even seeing them in that capacity, I remember this. While they may not remember me, their God remembers them. I lose nothing. And then he adds in verse 39, but raise it up at the last day. For this is the will of my Father, that everyone who beholds the Son and believes in Him will have eternal life. And I myself will raise him up at the last day. You read verse 7 of Ecclesiastes 12, and the Spirit returns to its Creator. For those who trusted Jesus Christ, aging is a blessing. Why? Because even though my mind may go and I can't remember, God's never does, and He does remember. And He made this whole house. And at the end of time, when He blows that trumpet, this old, corruptible, grasshopper, leg-dragging person gets a whole new life. That last one. And this mind, which is so vexed, angered, irritated at the realities of life, gets a whole new mindset. I'm going to a place where there's no sorrow, no grief, no tears. What I hear every day on truths everybody wants. But nobody seems to want to accept the reality of how to think. They want it, but they're not going to pay the price of bending their knee. Rejoice. Even as you age, you've got things to rejoice about. You live in a real world. You know there are times ahead that are going to be difficult and hard. Get ready for them. Do all that you can to take care of your mental health. How do you do that? How do you remove the vexation of life? You go to God in prayer. Remember, the wisest bit of advice as an old aging person that I can give to anybody is start early. Start early. Charles Bridges, pastor in Boston in the 19th century, wrote a commentary on Proverbs and Ecclesiastes. In his commentary on Ecclesiastes, he made this observation. He said, "Many have remembered too late, but none too soon." Remember now your Creator in the days of youth. It's always better to start early than later. Solomon gives us a call that in our age is desperately needed. To live a God-centered life. All of us. So, Father, this morning we come to the end of this text and we realize whether we are young or old, whether we have tracked for a few years or many years of our life, the call is still the same: to surrender our hearts to the God who loves us and sent His Son to die for us. And as we trek that path, you call us to be wise. For many of us, we look back across our years and we can rejoice in the goodness of God in our lives. And as we turn to face the future, we realistically understand we prepare. We get ready. We know the inevitable is going to happen to this old house. And even in our years of age, we still can rejoice. And we are still useful to the God of heaven. So, Lord, for a heart who has decided not to follow you, I pray this morning that by your tender Spirit, you might work in ways that no human being could. To cause reflection upon the fact that one day, someday, they will stand before you and give an account of the way they lived their life. Because everything matters. In Jesus' name. Amen. I'll be here afterwards if you've got a question.